homely sort of.
Very homely place,
yeah.
and the best of food.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd still go up to
We
Mass
start,
up
so
there sometimes.
Martin and Vera, thanks very much for doing this interview for us. We start with you, Vera, if you don't mind. Could you tell us first of all about your family, who your family are, where you came from, and all that?
I came from Snow Hill, which is opposite Cheek Point at this side of at our side of the river, and it was an estate, and it was owned by Violet O'Neill Power, and my family was involved with it from early 1900s because my grandfather was a land steward, and he came from up near Gorey to Snow Hill as a land steward. And he came and went, I think, as a land steward. I think Snow Hill went a bit broke in the early 1900s. And so he might have gone to another estate, but would always come back. Now, he had married a lady who was from Snow Hill. She was from, she was from actually beside the estate. And they lived on the estate always. The house they lived in, we ended up living in up until the place was sold in the 1950s. And I would think the house originally may have been a laundry because we lived in half the house, but the other half was, it was about the same size. My father used it as his workshop and shed and whatever, but it had a red tiled floor. And a vague memory that somebody told me as a child that it had been a laundry, probably all through the 1800s. So now, my grandfather then died in about 1911, and I lost track of what happened in Snow Hill for a while then because the war came as well shortly after. And my father and his brother were still young. They were going to Mount Sion school in town. And they both joined the British Navy when they were 15. And they went to, my father was invalided out of the Navy in 19, I think it was 1919 or 20. And but my uncle stayed in my uncle Pat, he stayed in the Navy all his life and retired when he was of retiring age and came home to Giles's Quay, where my aunt would have lived, and he went to live with her. And so that was the family connection with Snow Hill. And Violet O'Neill Power owned at Snow Hill, but she had been a very active person in the yeomanry in England during the war, and there's quite a nice book written about her. So when he came back from the war, she had come back to Snow Hill, and I think they got on extremely well. They probably had a lot in common of what they had seen and whatever. Now, she had seen more than my father, I'd say. He was on board ships. But he did serve on the ship, my son found out, he served on the ship that Shackleton was on. Shackleton, Tom Crean, can't remember which exactly, was it the Endeavour? He served on that ship because it's on the records. But I mean, years later, of course, you know. So he has his medals, my son has them now, and then he's continued on to work in Snow Hill, and he sort of, I'd say, took over as a land steward, but he wasn't a land steward qualified at all. And there was quite a few people worked in Snow Hill at the time. It was a very big place, and there was farm, they had a lot of tillage. There was always a 3-day thrashing. And there was a herd, a milking herd, but I'd say mainly other than that it was tillage. Mrs. Violet O'Neill Power was very interested in horses, so there was stables there. There was always a groom there, and they sowed a lot of flax, and they used to have the flax for the horses, and of course they had lofts over some of the stables that were full of flax, and there was a very old car there belonged to her. Now I gathered lately when the book was being written about her that she had bought a car for the yeomanry when she was in Europe in the First World War. And it would appear, it wasn't that car, but it would appear from the photograph to be the same as the car that was there now young. And I used to sit up in it, but she didn't drive it at the time. And so it was that kind of the horses in the stable yard, and some of the horses were good, but in my time I don't think they were winning many races now, Now, when I was 5, 1945, she got married. And she got married to a man from Emly in County Tipperary. His name was Hugh Ryan. And she went to live in Emly, but she came back to Snow Hill quite a bit because I used to see a lot of her. And she was extremely nice to me. And I'd be in around the house with her and whatever, and she was extremely nice person. But I never knew she had been in the war, knew nothing about her really other than that she was nice and that she wore different clothes because she was a bit bohemian to look at, But I didn't know what that meant at the time, Suddenly now looking back, I can see her with a red berry on the side of her head, so she was different. But now there was a beautiful church. That was a very big house, huge house. And there was a beautiful church in it, which I can remember well. And there were Pugin stations in it. Pugin Church, I think, but the stations were, and they were all sold, of course, when the house was knocked in the 50s when it was bought, which was a pity, But, well, I'm sure the roof wasn't the best, because I remember my father used to have nightmares about the roof when he was looking after the place because the lead used to continuously be stolen off the roof. And between that and local people putting in the odd few cattle on the land, he'd head off up the land and he'd come back cursing that there's 3 or 4 cattle in on it.
But it must have been very unusual for a child to be in like a big estate.
It probably was, but when you're there and you're the only one on it, it's brilliant, I had nobody to play with, but I played with bushes, and I played school, and I murdered the bushes, the briars would be hanging out. And I don't remember being lonely. I didn't know any different. Plus, we lived a couple of fields away from the Dwyers of Drumdowney, and they were farmers. And I went up and I played a lot up there. Now I did have a brother, but he had gone away to college when he was quite young. I suppose he went at 12 and I would have been 9, so, I up to that, until he was a boy, My father had a boat, we were talking about it earlier there. He built a boat, and he used to bring me off with them down the river and across to Cheek Point with 2 bicycles. And take out the bicycles, I'd get red lemonade in the pub in Cheek Point, which was still there, I think. And we'd head off on the bicycles and come back and go home the same way. So I had a great time, really, looking back.
And were you mentioned her wedding. Were you at the wedding? Or?
No, yes, I was. I was at the wedding, I would say, because my mother had come from the Midlands. But I think she was probably employed by Violet from the Dominican convent in Eccles Street, because I know she went to the Dominican convent in Eccles Street, because she used to say that she was looking out the window the morning that Kevin Barry was being marched up to be executed. I can remember her saying that. I mean, I didn't know where the place was at the time, but it does make a bit of sense now that I know where it is. And so
was she
I think
was she a bit of a Republican?
No. She was my mother.
Yes.
No. She was boarding in
Okay.
the convent, the Dominican convent.
Okay.
And the reason I mentioned that is that I think she may have been employed from there, because that was at the time a convent for training teachers in home economics. And she certainly had training in home economics. You know, you better sweep the floor right. And even that to that, but she was a great cook. And she worked in Snow Hill at that level. And what else can I say now?
So you were talking about the wedding.
Oh, yes. So I would say the reason I was at the wedding was that my mother would have been helping in the kitchen, because the food was all done in the kitchen. So I would say she was helping. There would have been nobody to mind me, and I would have been brought. I remember being in the back of the church, and the church to me was just so different to anything I'd ever seen. And then I was kept in the kitchen from then on, and I was under the table, and I was bouncing because I thought there was a rubber floor in it. And these are the memories. I'm sure there wasn't a rubber floor, but the beautiful big old kitchen. The same kitchen now would be in the one in the Killarney Muckross house. I went on a tour one time, and there were all the copper pots and pans, you know, and I thought I was back when I was a child again, you know. Wow. So, yeah.
And Vera, where did you go to primary school?
I went to primary school in Slieve Rue here until I was 8. And then I was sent to the nuns in Ferrybank. And I never went to Ringville, but everybody else around went to Ringville. I've no idea why. I used to envy them heading off.
And the primary school then in Slieve Rue up to 8, what can you remember from that?
I remember Miss Den was the teacher when you went first. I can remember learning how to knit. I can't remember learning how to do anything else. I have one other memory of being in the shed at lunchtime. No, I wouldn't have died. I thought this minute. And God be good to Paddy Wall. I was sitting on a ledge that was at the bottom of the tin shed, having brown bread. And he came over and he said, "There's a rat behind you." And I gave him cheek anyway, you know, and didn't jump up. So he had to go off with himself. God be good to Paddy Wall. But I have a vivid memory of that, you know. Now, the school itself, Miss Den was a lovely, lovely, lovely teacher. And I used to meet her over the years in town. She's dead just a few years. She was very elderly when she died. But Mr. Carey was in the next room and never went into him. You know, I left when I was 8, so I did make my first communion from there. There was about probably 8 or 9 for communion, that was all. And open fire, you were lucky. Somebody brought the sticks. I didn't bring any anyhow because I was on a bicycle, so. But that was how it was, you know.
Okay, we'll hold it there and we'll go over to you, Martin. So Martin, could you tell me about your family?
Yeah, I was born in Rochestown, which is in the parish of Glenmore, but it was right next to the parish of Slieve Rue. And all my family and the families around went to school in Ringville, which was the parish of Slieve Rue. So from the time, up to the age of 14, I was a Slieve Rue person, really, going to Mass, communion a lot in Slieve Rue, school in Ringville and all that. My father was Billy Forristal, and he was born in the same house as I was born. And my mother, she came from Kinna-Ballycalan, Bridie Colfer, and she's still alive, she's 96. My father is dead about 11 years now. And his father was a Martin Forristal. I was called after him. And like all the Forristals lived in that same house I was born from 1744. I've traced the family back to 1744, and all those lived in the house that I was born in. Now that house is no longer there now. We renovate, we kind of added bits on and kind of knocked a bit out of it and all that, maybe 30 years ago or so. My father worked in Clover Meats. He went in there in 1935 as a kind of an apprentice at the time, and he worked there like until almost it closed, nearly in 84 or 83. He had gone before it closed, and so he worked there all his life. And my mother came over from Kinna, and she worked in Tramore with the Jacobs. They were a big family in Tramore, a maid with them. And then she came to work for Mr. Brennan. He was the manager of Clover Meats in Christendom in Waterford, and that's where my father met her. And my father at the time, like where the Athenaeum Hotel is there now, that was a hostel for Clover Meats workers at the time, and he stayed there, and it was a pound per week, and his wages at the time were £1.06. So he hadn't much entertainment value, like I mean, for what he had left. But he always talked about that place there, especially a man called Martin White. Martin White only died about 2 years ago. He was 100, but played with Kilkenny in 1932, 33, 34, 35. And he always spoke about him. They stayed there together. But my grandfather, he was one of 8 or 9, and he worked with, there was a Benjamin Lamley Conn. They were a family from Passage that came and bought Mount Ida, although they called it Mount Ida. It wasn't Mount Ida before they bought it, just next to us. It was a farm of 147 acres, but it also had landlord rights to 1,000 acres. And they, this Benjamin Lamley Conn, they came there in 1850, and they built a palatial house there, a beautiful house there. And it was there until 1977, when unfortunately there was a major fire and it was burned, and 2 of the children were burnt. The whole children who had it were burned in that year. But the Conns, my grandfather inherited a job from his uncle as a coachman for Benjamin Lamley Conn, and he was married to a Miss Tench. She was from South Wexford, a very big family as well. And like his job, like if she was going back to South Wexford, he'd drive her down with the coach and horses and stay there for 3 days maybe. So he had a nice life. And eventually, I just transgressed a little bit. What happened there was Benjamin Lamley Conn, he ran another family in Dublin. He was married in Dublin as well, and to a woman called Battersby. And eventually his wife found out, and so she kind of read the right act to him anyway. So what he had to do was, he had to hand over, will the farm to her nephew, who was a Dr. Phillips in Sligo. And the only thing that he got out of it was that Dr. Phillips was to take his name as well. So he was known then as Dr. Phillips Conn. And my grandfather worked with him as a coachman then, until they sold the farm in 1917. And like going way back, as I say, the house I was born in must have been there from around the 1700s. And it was a thatched house, a fairly normal thatched house, but there was room on it. Obviously was thatched years before that, but it was zinc. And we had 3 rooms in the house, 5 of us, and parents and grandfather. And all the boys lived in the zinc roof. And like, I suppose it's unbelievable nowadays, but my grandfather slept in that room as well. But in that room as well, we had all our bicycles. My father kept maybe a bag or two of oats for the horse there as well. And there could be potatoes, and maybe, like, I still remember, like, my father, he was good at killing pigs and goats. We used to have goats at the time, and he used to kill the kids. But often you wake up in the morning, you see the kids were hanging up in the ceiling, like, you know. So, but that was fairly normal for that time. It wasn't unusual or anything like that for that time. And like, I went to school in Ringville then, like, you know, and
Ringville wouldn't be the closest place to you, was it?
Yes, it would have been.
The closest primary school?
Yes, Glenmore was 4 miles. Ringville was maybe slightly less than 3. And then there was a kind of the local families, like, that were older than us. They went to Ringville, like Alice Welsh and the Elwards. So, like, I went off to school with them when my time came in 1947. And I spent until I was 13 there.
What's your earliest memory to school then in Ringville?
Yeah, like, I remember, like, we say the school was built, like, in 1879. My grandfather actually, he went to the old school, which is a attached school down down the Castle Lane, and he went for 1 day there in 1879. And then when the new school opened, he went up there in August of that year. And I went to that school. Mrs. Burke, who was a granddaughter of the original teacher in the Castle Lane school, Francis Drew, himself and his wife, they came from Durrow in County Laois, and they came there in 1852 to the Thatch School. And they taught there. Francis Drew retired on the 30th of May, 1879, and he died the following day. He didn't get much from retirement anyway. but his wife continued. Marianne, to teach in Ringville, and the first teacher that came there was the Joseph Brennan. He came there till 1888. And then a principal teacher came, Dick Grace. He was from Kilbride and Glenmore, my own parish. He came there in 1894. And himself and that Francis Drew's wife, they taught there, as well as their daughter Emma. And, like, conveniently enough, he married the daughter, and they continued to teach there until he retired in 1924. And Mrs. Burke, she was a Bridie Grace, we'd call her, his daughter. She taught with him as in the school as well. And she was what they call a junior assistant mistress. She wasn't a fully qualified teacher. But when I went to school, we had 2 teachers there then. The principal, who came in 1924, Julia Cotter, she was from Cork, and she later married a Power from Waterford. So Mrs. Power, we knew her as. And Mrs. Burke was way ahead of her time as a teacher. She was a gregarious type of person and travelled widely. And her method of teaching, like, was kind of telling stories about her past and about kind of a political woman as well. Like, when I went to school in 1947, it was only 2 years after the war. And she kind of regaled us with stories about the war. And we didn't realise at the time, I didn't realise at the time, like, which side she was on. But she wasn't a lover of the crown. And she had 2 dogs called Tito and Rommel, so you could see which side she was on. But she, like, her methods of teaching, and I was talking to my sister the other day, like, she remembers probably more than I do, like, you know, we all remember what we like to remember, I suppose. But what she had was little trays of sand, maybe half-inch thick or so, which is filled with sand, and wooden skewers like from the butchers, and that's the way you learn to write, in the sand, and then you could refresh it again and do it again. And for counting, she had glass.
No copybooks.
Not that we did. I don't remember copybooks in her school now. Maybe I had, but I don't remember them. And for counting, she had glass bottle tops. They were from chef sauce bottles. They were that chef is still going, but they were used as counters, and probably later on, I suppose, beer bottle tops, I suppose, were used anyway, like, you know. And she had reels, you know, the only thread reels, used ones, and she'd have them had hanging on the wall in a semicircle with 10 on each semicircle, and they might be coloured even. And then she had one big reel right above that semicircle, which was a 10. And then in the next one, then she had 10 of those all around the place. So, like, she was way ahead of her time into teaching mathematics and things like that, like, you know. And I remember my sister was telling me this, that the inspector used to come, and the inspector in actual fact was living down in Ferrybank, and Mr. Convery, Buddy Norris bought the place eventually, and but he came into the school, into Mrs. Buck's school anyway, and like they normally ask people to sing a song and things like that. But anyway, he asked if somebody would tell a story in Irish, because stuff learning was all through Irish there in the school. And so my sister gave him a story in Irish, and that evening my brother, who was in the junior school as well, he came home very perturbed altogether, because the story she had told was about my father. He had a bag of oats in the pony house, a barrel of oats, and he was cleaning it out. He had come to the end of the barrel, and when he was cleaning it out, he found a nest of mice, and they were only obviously a day or two old. They were pink. So he called my sister out to have a look at it, and she lifted the nest of mice and brought it in to my mother, and my mother got up on the table. But what perturbed my brother was, because he was a little more private person than me or my sister, that people should know we had mice at home. And like the truth is, we had rats and mice, and we lived quite comfortably with them. And another, she was a kind of a devilish type of person, my sister, always inquisitive and all that. And in the school, like, there was 2 school rooms, one on each side of the school, junior, kind of senior school, but in between you had 2 residences where the teachers did live. They didn't live there in my time. But my sister and a few more girls went upstairs in Mrs. Buck's quarters, which they weren't supposed to do. And what they found up there, among other things, was a whole set of gas masks from the war. And they put on these gas masks and they were running around. Mrs. Buck heard them. There was hell to play altogether. I don't know how they arrived there. Maybe they were supplied during the war, but I suspect Mrs. Burke's sister was married to a man called Captain Martin Bates. He was in the army, and maybe his or none of that. But those kind of things, I suppose. Oh yes, another thing about Mrs. Burke was she had a baby Ford. Maybe it's a model T4, but I think it was a baby Ford car. But like those cars, like they started with a starting handle, like, you know, and often it wouldn't start anyway. So we were like, there was a huge hill next to English School. She'd drive down the hill, but she'd forget to leave out the clutch, and the car would arrive down the bottom of the hill, and we'd have to push it up again. But one of the days anyway, there was a man, Tom Shea, and Tom was an old man at the time. He lived in Rochestown. He was grandfather of Richard Shea, Peggy Shea, and Tom and Shea in Ringville. And so he came on the scene anyway. So she got him to to crank the handle up, like, you know, and the handle, you see, was connected to the drive shaft of the car, like, you know. Dangerous kind of a mechanism, because when the car started, the handle could fly up, like, you know. But anyway, he started the car anyway, but Mrs. Burke was a bit slow in putting her foot on the accelerator, and the car conked out again. And Tom Shea said to her, "Ma'am," he said, "couldn't you keep her cluttering?" He said, "when you had her cluttering," he said. And her husband, Paddy Burke, they lived down in Bellevue here. And her brother lived, Paddy Grace, they lived together in a land commission farm actually down in Bellevue. But the two lads, like, they weren't too fond of work or anything like that. And if they wanted to go to town for something, what they'd do is in the morning, they'd take the lead off the plugs. So Mrs. Burke, when she came out, couldn't start the car, so she'd have to take off the bike. So the boys were in the car to town, like, you know, so so that, like, that was Mrs. Like that, that time as well, like in both schools, when I went into Mrs. Power School, like, you know, we had lunch every day, and I was asking my mother even yesterday, what kind of lunches did we have? And like what we had really was lunch and sausage was kind of popular at the time. My father worked in Clover Meats too, I suppose, and we had plenty of it, I suppose, then. Maybe a bread and jam sandwich, or bananas had come kind of popular again after the war, so you might have banana and sugar sandwich, like, you know. And she was telling me that most kind of sandwiches were wrapped in newspaper. We were lucky enough that my father worked in Clover Meats and he got greaseproof paper, so they were wrapped in that. And there were other people that I knew, they were neater again. They had lovely brown paper, and they had it folded the same as you'd fold a book, like, you know, it's all quite a beautiful arrangement. And during the winter we had cocoa, and during the fine weather we had milk. But there was no electricity in the school or water, so like the bigger boys, we say the last 2 years we were there, we had to walk down Danny Whalen's lane, maybe about a half a mile for water. And on the way back we'd be collecting, I remember, hurts. They were lovely, beautiful little small fruit on the way back. And of course we had to put the kettle on the fire then, on the crock, and boil it up then and make the cocoa. And that time most of the boys wore short trousers, and until they were confirmed anyway. And most people, including the girls, like, they had knitted pullovers, because knitting was I suppose just from financial reasons at the time, because there wasn't any money around, and kind of knitting was a very popular thing, like for the mothers, so they knitted jumpers and all that. And most people wore boots and long socks. The boys had long socks turned down below the knee. And because money was scarce that time, the economy, like in 1947, 48, that kind of a time after the war, very uncertain time. And like, my father worked in Clover Meats, but thinking back, he was the only one maybe or two from the school that, you know, that their dads worked in a place like Clover Meats. Mm-hmm. Most people worked with farmers and fishing very popular at the time. Mm-hmm. So money wasn't plentiful, but I think people were happy because your next door neighbour had a hell of a lot more than you had, maybe less maybe. So there were happy times, like, you know.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second, because I want to come
Yep.
back to Ringwood in a minute. Vera, just in relation to, you said when you were 8 when you went off to Ferrybank.
Yes.
So what was it like going into Ferrybank at that time?
What was it like? I prefer not to have gone to Ferrybank, but it was a longer journey as well.
How'd you get in?
The reason given for me being sent to Ferrybank, I'm not sure it was the actual reason, but the reason was that my brother was at that stage going into Mount Sion. He had just started in Mount Sion. And so I was sent to Ferrybank because I was wild on a bicycle and he'd mind me. Same fella wouldn't even wait for me. He'd be gone way ahead of me. I was still on my own. That was the reason given. I'll never forget the day my mother, and she hadn't told me what she was doing, coming up Ferrybank from town, and she pulled into the Canon Ryan's, it was Canon Brennan at the time, Canon Brennan's gateway, and leaving down the bicycle, and said, I want to see the Canon about you. I was petrified. I still can remember how frightened I was. And all she wanted was to put my name down and could I leave Sleeveroe and go to Ferrybank. And she gave him that reason, that I was wild on a bicycle. She probably wasn't wrong there, but like, my brother was about 6 months, from September to January going to Mount Sion. When he struck Pierva Gate coming home from Mount Sion, and he never went back to Mount Sion, he went to Kilkenny, because he spent quite a long time in hospital, he fractured his skull. And he never went back to Mount Sion, and I was still going to Ferrybank, and I was still wild on the bike and still on my own.
And was Ferrybank,
So-
was it much more stricter than Sleeveroe?
Well, they were nuns, and they were different, yeah. I don't know whether they were any more strict, but I suppose at that age you were a bit afraid of everything, you know. And then I was from the heart of the country, and here I was being called a culshie, because they were all from Ferrybank, and they were, you know, up there and different. And I was coming in with a red nose on a bicycle every morning, and my hands paining me with the cold.
And then you also didn't see
But
all
you
your
got used to
friends
all those
out
things.
Sleeveroe then, very much.
Well, I didn't. You see, I was too far from anywhere to have a bunch of friends anywhere, because you didn't go from home. I was at home, and I was very happy to be at home, and there wasn't really anybody to play with. There was one family living down in the marsh. Do you remember 2 houses down in the marsh? They belonged to Carney's. I think Carney's probably would have owned the houses, and there was one family there, and the remains of that family are now over in Clune. They were Mars, but they moved. They went to live over in Clune, and after that nobody lived down there. Before that, when I was young, I remember there was a James E. Baldwin living in one of those houses. He was killed on the railway, which reminds me of something else now that I would have forgotten to say. Across the marsh from us and up towards Bellevue, there was another big house. Wouldn't have been like Snow Hill, but it was Mount Prospect. And it was owned by a family called Anderson. There was Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, and a son called, we always knew him as Master Bill. Now, I was too young, I didn't really know him. But they were lovely people, and they gave a Christmas party for all the children in the whole area every Christmas. My brother did get to go because he was a bit older than I was. And I can still see a black ball that he got, that if you dropped it would hit the ceiling, you know. It was a great, good quality thing. But anyhow, Master Bill went to the war and he was killed. And her husband used to cycle into town, and he cycled off into town one day and he dropped dead. She was left by herself. Now, I was sitting at home with my brother and my mother, and somebody called her, I've no idea who, and she gave us a box of pennies to play with at the table, and we were warned, and if you were warned you didn't step out of line, that we were not to leave the table till she came back. What had happened was Mrs. Anderson had walked down the railway with her little white dog. Train came, dog ran out, she followed it, and she was killed. So there was nobody left, which left the Russells that came. Do you remember Dr.
Yes,
Russell?
the Russells, yeah.
He was a distant cousin. He wasn't closely related, and he came to live there. And he eventually built another house, which would be Knockmullen now. And the original house, when the port took over down there, the house was supposed to be preserved, and but the roof suddenly disappeared off it. So it's a ruin.
I mean, a lot of the big houses in this area disappeared.
Disappeared.
But I mean, also in this area too, I suppose, with all those big houses were probably a lot of Protestant people and Quaker. Was there different Quaker?
Well, Violet O'Neill Power was a Catholic.
Okay.
Now she had been born in England, I think, and all that, but they were very much Catholics, yeah. Yeah. Bellevue Powers were probably Catholics as well.
All right.
Now, I don't remember Bellevue House as a standing house, only a ruin. But I do remember Mount Prospect well. I mean, I would have been in around there as a kid. And I'll tell you, there was one character living down there, Marty might know about him, John Lonergan.
No, I didn't know him, no.
Did you not?
No.
John Lonergan was a man, he lived in a tiny little house. Now, from where I lived, you'd walk up the railway a bit and then in off the railway, and he had a tiny little house just below Mount Prospect House. And he always wore a sailor's, the pull-down hat at the time, but both his feet were clubbed. And so he never wore shoes, but he walked up and down to the river. He was known by all the fishermen and everybody. He knew the river like the back of his hand. And he could tell fishermen where not to go and where to go. He really was an expert on it. Had no relations whatsoever, and lived alone there. And he died, and Jim Welsh only reminded me lately that he's prayed for every year here, even though he had no relations, and Jim was wondering who would get him prayed for. So I made inquiries around at home, and I discovered that it was John Fitzpatrick, who would have lived just up the road from him. But all those years later, he still gets him prayed for every year.
And given the fact I had disabled,
Yes.
You weren't frightened of him, right?
I thought he was God's gift. I used to come walking over and walk up, and he had a long bench outside the door. Sit in beside him and he'd tell you stories. And I thought he was... Now today you'd be afraid, to let kids off, if you didn't know exactly what these people were made of, but he was just a lovely character.
And what kind of stories would he tell you?
He'd tell you stories about the river and the sea and the boats, and I don't remember the stories, but I know he was interesting. And I'd always listen to a story, whatever it was about anyway. So also we used to go over there sometimes. Did anybody tell you that there was a London and Newcastle L&N shop in town? They had a van on the road, a very big van. It used to come to Snow Hill Gates. It also used to come down to right outside John Lonergan's house. And we'd either go to either place to do the heavy shopping, like the flour and wheat meal, and because everybody made their own bread and whatever. And there was two men on that. You know about that van, do you? No. There was two men on that. It was a big van done out like a shop. And one of them drove and the other man was in the back, and it was very same as buying from a shop. And they came every Wednesday. And that was a fantastic thing. Also, the breadmen used to come around. Well, the breadmen were coming around in my time as well, after I got married. But, so things weren't as hard as you think they were. I mean, I lived on an estate. I can never remember that there wasn't a bucket of milk behind the door in the hall, standing into a bucket of cold water, or a big can of milk standing into a bucket of cold water. I can never remember that there was no milk, or we had our own hens, so things weren't that awful at all if you could go back and realise all the good things you had. And what I loved about living in Snow Hill, apart from anything else, was, I know some people don't agree, but I loved the hunt coming through with the Major McCalmont, all dressed in the red coats. They'd come first, and you could watch them, and they'd take the ditches and down into the marsh out over right beside the house, and I'd be waiting for this to happen, and you'd hear the bugle being. There was a lot of magic about it.
And who was the major, did you say?
Major McCalmont, who was from Mount Juliet is now.
Juliet, yeah.
Yeah. I imagine there was another major after him.
Well, McCalmont,
He was Major McCalmont
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
I don't know whether
Yeah,
his son
yeah.
would be a major or
His
who
son
took
followed
over.
him. But that's gone now, of course. It's Mount
Yeah.
Juliet Golf Course now,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Martin, you also mentioned that when you were in the primary school in Ringville, you were saying that quite a few of the lads, their dads were fishing.
Yes.
Like, the fishing seemed to be quite big at that time.
Oh, very big.
It's completely gone now.
You're completely gone.
But
Yeah,
do you remember
like,
anything?
like at the time, there were two types of fishing, trawling and drifting. Drifting was illegal above the Barrow Bridge, which in this area is above the Barrow Bridge, but it went on like wholesale. The trawling was a professional setup. Like you had a boat with normally 3 men in the boat, and one man would stay on the shore while the other 2 row the boat out in a semicircle, and the net would go around in a semicircle. Now the net itself, that net didn't catch the fish. They had a big bag, what we call a bag, a special mesh at the end of that net, and when they rowed into shore again, they pulled the net in, and at the end of that net was that bag, a special mesh, and like the fish were caught there. It was salmon and pale. Pale would be young salmon, but I do remember myself. We used to go down from our house. It was only a couple of 100 yards down to the river, and like I did see the biggest catch that was ever made, 63 salmon in the one sweep.
God.
Now, obviously, the price of the fish wouldn't be as good when there were 63 salmon, but I do remember fish for a half a crown a pound, like, you know. And the fishermen made very, very good money because there was plenty of fish. And there was a house next to us, Paddy Forristal, no relation of ours, and they had a lovely stone floor in an out office, and that's where the fish were stored. And Murphy's and New Ross, they were the wholesalers, they were the exporters of fish. And a fellow called Dixie Brazel, I remember him well, he was the driver of the truck. But I remember that truck coming out maybe 2 and 3 times a day
Oh my God.
to bring in fish. There were so many fish coming in at some stages, like, you know.
And you said the trawling was the kind of legal version.
The trawler was legal.
And what was how did they do it illegally? How did they catch the salmon illegally?
Well, yeah, the drifting was like, I mean, where 2 men went out in the boat and they just put out the net and dragged it after the boat. And any fish that would maybe hit the net, might be caught in the net. And like there was a bailiff in New Ross, Mikey Green, but at the time he had a rowing boat. So to be a long time before he'd come down, and like my father was a kind of a lookout. Especially at night, he might be coming home late at night, and if he saw a bailiff coming, he'd light a fire on the hill so everybody would see it, like, you know. And and then there was a third kind of way, a stake net, illegal as well, and that was just put on the shore, net out maybe 20 yards out, and when the tide would come in, catch a number of fish. So like it certainly brought an awful lot of money to a lot of people that time. Like I remember there might be 7 crews of 3 people passing by our house every day, like, you know. And like most of those then kind of worked with farmers during the winter. Like the best of the season, like the season started in February, but really the best of the season was June, July. And the end of the season was the 15th of August. And the 15th of August was a huge day in Tramore, and that was the end of the fishing season. And I do remember, I was never there myself at the time, but I do remember people talking about it. They had a big dance there in Tramore, and another big one in the Limpy in Waterford on the 15th of August.
God, always.
And anybody, like all the fishermen went in, but anybody who wanted to pick a fight with somebody else was there as well. Whether it's about politics or about what, and there was always a good punch up at that particular dance, the 15th of August, and of course they would have been drinking all day anyway, so it kind of had the ingredients of a good night, like, you know.
And Martin, you were talking about how long your family has been in the area, and also yourself, Vera. Just Was there ever any stories about the famine in this area? How it affected the area?
No, not really. But it, like, when I look back, like, and look at people that lived in that time, like from my own family, like a lot of them emigrated to America, but the famine never hit kind of South Kilkenny very much at all. And like you had, say in Ringville itself, you had Lady Esmond, Lady Letitia Esmond, and she was exceedingly generous to people. And so much so, she built Ringville School, and the old school, I'd call it, yeah, and she built the new one as well that I went to. She built that one, and she also left, I was reading her will even last night, and the amount of money that she left to her servants and to local people, kind of an annuity like. And at the time I was in Ringville School, there was a fund, a trust that was entrusted to the parish priest, and that was for buying shoes for needy families, and that was there when I was there. You know, so she was so you had people like her, that like the famine then didn't affect people as much as it did in kind of West Waterford and places where it did, but not in South Kilkenny. And I never heard my grandfather died in 1955, and his brother died in, I think it's 1970 something, he was 92, but I never heard them speaking about the famine. And like people went to America, I suppose, that time because there were no jobs around anyway. And people like the first of my family that went there, they went there in 1845. And of course, what happened was like he went to Boston, and then all the rest of the families followed, and they all were in the same area, a place called Newton in Boston, and so. The famine, no, didn't affect South Kilkenny.
Did you ever hear any stories?
No.
No.
No, and I suppose because of the kind of area it was and the land that was there, it was all good land, and there was a lot of hunting done, and the fishing would have made a huge difference as well.
Yeah, fishing was good, yeah.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
And then growing up then in the area, I mean, was there, like, what happened to you then, Vera? Where did you go after school then? What happened to you after that?
When I went after school, when I left school, I left school at 16 after my inter, and there was a job ready for me in Clover Meads, but I never intended to stay in it, but I waited till I got my chance and I went nursing. And I nursed here and there, I mean always here. I never went abroad at all. And I worked with psychiatric patients. I worked in Belmont for years. And then I left and I went to work with children with special needs in Waterford, up until I finished up working altogether. So.
But that was really funny that you said that you had a job in Clover Meads, if you wanted.
The job was there for me the day after I was 16.
But there's a big
My mother told me it was there, and that was it, and then off I went on my bicycle.
There's a big connection between here and Clover, isn't
Oh, huge.
When it was open.
Even though there was, my mother knew somebody who had that job ready for me, and I didn't particularly want, and I remember the nuns told her off, because, and she came home and said it, but I was still going to Clover Meads. The nuns said, if she'd, I think they thought I didn't want to go back to school. If she'd come back to school, she could end up in, what way did they put it? In the civil service. And I had no idea what the civil service was. I didn't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I went to Clover Meads anyway, and I took my own way after that. I stayed there for 4 years though.
All right. Well, were you in the factory?
In the factory,
yeah.
making sausages, yeah, I was, yeah.
And Martin, tell us, where did you end up then after?
I went to St. Kieran's College as a boarder when I was 13. And like at the time, Dr. Hughes, like, I mean, had great connection with Kieran's. I kind of wanted to go to De La Salle or someplace, and I got a scholarship for De La Salle as well. But Dr. Hughes, Morris, he was a boss. He insisted that I went to boarding school in Kieran's. And After Cairns I went to university, but drink took me over and I never qualified. I went to England for a couple of years, came back and I was very lucky. I got a technical job in the ESB. And about 1971, Vera nursed me below in the alcoholic unit in Belmount, and that was 46 years ago, and I didn't drink since. And people asked me, like, you know, that I must have saved a lot of money, which I did. I saved about $250,000 in that time, but I'm after spending 300,000.
And Martin, that must have been very unusual for a young lad in this area to get to university, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was even unusual, I suppose, in that time, 1954, to go to a boarding school, because in Slieverue here, the technical school started about the same time, and that was a wonderful, wonderful educational unit that Dr. Hughes started, and he kind of built it by voluntary labour. The lads who kind of went in, the first students there, they built it, they gave a hand to build it. And Christy Fiore was a marvellous principal there. And of course it grew, over the years. But it gave people trades, the whole lot. So, I think in Cairns, there was myself and my brother and Willie Carrowan, and I think John Donovan, or Christy Donovan, were the only people who went to boarding school. Now, whether that was good or bad, I don't know. My own kind of reckoning of that, I lost out part of my life for my family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think it didn't do me any good,
No.
kind of relationship-wise and things like that. That you were 5 years, because in boarding school you went in there in September, you went out and came out for a week or two in December, but your parents had no transport to come and see you, and it wasn't encouraged anyway for a start, So, it was a difficult time, I thought myself, and I was lucky enough that I suppose I wasn't affected too much, but I know friends of mine who were bullied and it had an effect on their lives, and it sure had on mine as well, but it wasn't all good then, I think,
And Martin, just to go back a little bit to your primary school, can you remember any of the other pupils that were there at the time, any of the characters or any of the lads that you
Sorry?
Can you remember any of the other pupils in your primary school?
Yeah.
At the time, and interesting characters or anything like that?
Yeah, I suppose. Well, I remember. I suppose Mrs. Power had a new Morris Minor. She had a car before that. I can't remember what it was, but she had a new Morris Minor, and a group of the lads anyway. One evening, I knew it was going on, but I was a kind of a quiet chap, and I was clever enough, to enjoy the prank, but stand a bit back from, we say, any danger of that happening after that. But what they did was they put up a part of a potato or an apple core up in the exhaust. When she came out, she couldn't start the car. Now, I knew it was happening, and I was waiting for something to happen the following day, but nothing happened. What happened was, obviously, she was gathering information. So the following morning, anyway, I remember him well, Tom Dwyer, afterwards a very successful farmer and president of the ICSMA. And I remember I could still see him confidently going into school, and he threw his bag behind the big desk, and if he did, Mrs. Power came to him with both hands across his face. He didn't know what happened to him. And he was followed by John Meyler, and he got the same. But there was a man, Jackie Phelan. Jackie lived at the Crossing Gates, and all his family went to Ringville. But Jackie was kind of a maintenance man for Ringville, he used to be doing little odd jobs around the place. And I remember one particular day, Ringville School, the windows are very high, and there was a little hill behind it. He used to be working there, and they were forging that, But he'd be looking in the window, and when he got Mrs. Powers back onto the writing board, onto the board, he'd be making faces at the pupils inside, you see. And of course there'd be a bit of a laugh, and Mrs. Power couldn't understand what was happening. And it happened 2 or 3 times. But the next time she turned around really fast and caught Jackie. But he, you know, so she went out straight away. We didn't hear what she said, but that was the end of that caper anyway, like, you know.
And come here, do you know the way, way back, you know, with the old people and all that, would they have been superstitious and all that kind of stuff? Would they believe?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And in things like, you know,
The banshee and things.
yeah, all that kind of stuff. Would that be?
Yeah, there was a farmer up the road from us, and like, they were the kind of family that they didn't move out much, but pish rogues was the big thing with them. And like, for instance, we'll say, like, if their potato crop like had small spuds in it, they believed the fairies gave the big spuds to the neighbours. And I remember when we got electricity in about 1955, and they didn't take it at the time, of course, because I suppose they thought like it was an evil kind of a thing or whatever. But what they had was, they had a battery radio, and they used to listen to the radio, but every so often, because the battery radios were very inconsistent, to say the least, of things, you know, there'd be a lot of interference on it. But old John Forristal, anyway, when it come to 6 o'clock, we listened to the news, and if interference came on the radio, he'd say to his sister, he said, "That's Bridie Forristal below cooking the sausages for Billy," interrupting the radio. and they were people that never swept the house in May, or never painted in September. Like,
That was the belief.
Oh, that was the belief, yeah.
No,
And I suppose that's the way they were brought up, and you know.
I mean, the maybush.
Yeah, well, of course, the maybush was very popular, and funny enough, the only maybush I see now is Michael Forristal down in Kilmurray. Every year he has the maybush up, all decorated up with ribbons and the whole lot. It's the only one I know of.
Oh, this would be hawthorn, is it? Hawthorn, is it?
It's what?
Maybush.
The maybush.
Yeah, is it hawthorn?
Oh yes, hawthorn, yes, the hawthorn. Like at home now, and in most places, like we had a big manure heap in the front yard, right in front of the front door. The maybush was put on top of that.
One that didn't take root.
And of course, it was a pagan custom as well.
Yeah, but I mean, I think a lot of those beliefs kind of went when electricity came in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Vera, do you remember any of those things about the banshee or the fairies or anything?
I do, yeah. Now, again, about the same time, I suppose, Marty, we got electricity, but we didn't have electricity till we moved out of Snow Hill, because electricity never came down into Snow Hill. But I don't remember at home having any stories. The only thing I was afraid of for years, I think, even after the war, I can remember being afraid to go to sleep when I was very small, because I thought, you see, Campile had been bombed, and you'd hear about that. You'd hear a lot about it when I was small. And I'd hear this chuk, 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 and I'd think, oh, the planes are coming, they're going to bomb us again, and I'd be petrified. Sure, it was something on the river that was actually, I doubted they were dredging at night, but like this chuk, 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 petrified. And probably afraid to ask. Or would, you know, but I can still remember how afraid to go asleep. And how going to sleep was going to stop me from being bombed out of the house, I don't know. But yeah, things like that. Now, later on, I remember hearing, and I was 15 when we moved up out of Snow Hill, and up to Gurteens, Gurteens is the area, and the headless coach, you know, there was still talk about the headless coach coming in and out of Bellevue gates.
Yeah.
and a black dog coming out. Now, I can still remember going to dances. I used to go to dances on my bike, on my own, because there was nobody else to go with. And I'd come home at all hours on my own. Wouldn't be afraid until I'd come to Bellevue Gate, and boy, would I go fast. You know, they'd stick with you even though you kind of know it was rubbish, but you weren't sure it was rubbish. And you were young, and, you know. So, yeah, there was a lot of things to be afraid of from that point of view.
And
yeah.
what was the thing about Bellevue then? What was it, Bellevue Gates? What was...
The
Why was it
headless
scary?
coach. The headless coach was... The man on the coach was headless, wasn't that
yeah.
it? Yeah.
But it always seemed to kind of be around areas where you had big estates.
Big estates,
And
yeah.
I suppose it was kind of sometimes like it was, I won't say the hatred of those people, but, you know, they didn't look too kindly on those maybe, and
Yeah.
that was a vision in their mind.
Yeah.
But I do know houses even now, like, are definitely haunted. There's one in Glenmore,
Yeah.
and like families had to move out. Like,
Yeah.
you know, they heard babies crying and things like that happening, like, you know. Now, admittedly, all right, as you said, kind of when electricity came, it kind of got rid of the banshee and all those, like, you know.
Yeah.
And like my first job in the ESB, in actual fact, was to canvass for electricity. It had been done, that was 1967, but it had been done, let's say, around 55. Most areas were done. But an awful lot of people that time didn't take it for various reasons. They'd burn thatched houses, for instance. They wouldn't have it in a thatched house or anything like that. And like I went around South Wexford at the time, canvassing for electricity. And some people, even then, were kind of, what they didn't like was
Afraid of it.
their 2 monthly bill. They never had a bill up to them.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking the other day, now, completely different than what you're talking about, but like a Morris Minor car in 1954 was about £400. And £400, if you equated to the average wage at that time, which was probably about £6-7 was the average wage at that time. So that was 300 a year's salary, a year's wage for a motor car. Now a year's wage now on the average salary, say of 35,000, like you get a fairly good car. But the only difference is, I suppose, in that time, people had no overheads whatsoever. Now we have television, we have mobile phones, everything is
right.
costing money. Mortgages were never heard of that time. When people got married, there was always the house up the road was vacant. People give it to them, do it up. So I suppose, like, there were better times really, in that stress wasn't a factor.
We were more self-sufficient as well, because like there was a garden everywhere, and you had your own potatoes
Yeah.
and your own vegetables and
Yeah.
rhubarb and maybe apples,
Yeah.
gooseberries and
Everybody
currants.
kept
Jam
2
was
pigs.
made. Yeah,
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah, my mother used to keep pigs.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we leave it at that.
Yeah, okay.
All
That
right.
was great. That was great.
Yeah.
It was a really interesting story, the 2 stories. And,
Yeah.
that was brilliant.
Okay.
There was only one
Okay.
person I didn't mention, which would be wrong of me. My brother
Keep going.
went
keep
to
going.
my
Kieran's.
brother went to Mount Sion, and I went because I was wild. Now, within 3 months, he fractured his skull off a bicycle. I had said that bit, but he never went back to Mount Sion. He went to St. Kieran's, and he was in St. Kieran's around
Yeah,
the
when I
same
was
time
there,
as
yeah.
Marty, but he didn't come back. He went over to the ecclesiastical side. He was going to be a priest up until he was 22, and then he came home. And he went to England, and he taught in England for a good few years, and he died when he was 43. He's buried up here in the graveyard. Yeah.
And did he
So-
get married?
He did get married, yeah. He had no family. Yeah.
She was an English woman.
An English woman. I'm still in touch with her. Every Christmas we write to each other, yeah. But, yeah, so, yeah, I'm sure all his years away from home didn't do him any good either, you know. But, that's how things go.
Yeah.
And I just thought I'd mention him, seeing that there was only the two of us, and I should say
Absolutely.
Yeah.
he existed, and
Absolutely.
I met him in London, actually.
Did you?
Marty met him in London
met him in
afterwards.
London.
Yeah.
Is that where you live, London?
Oh no, locally, but Marty met my brother. He went to England, you see.
Yeah, but when he was in England, did he live in London?
He did. Oh yeah. His wife's ex-wife, well, widow, but she married somebody that they both had known, and she's living in Eltham. And I heard somebody being interviewed from Eltham during the elections the other night, and I went, oh. It's in the area of Woolwich, and he taught in Woolwich. I was just saying to Marty met him with a friend of his from
that's right.
Kieran's,
Yeah.
John Costigan. He was from Bray in Wicklow. And I remember John Costigan used to be getting onto him. He was a teacher in St. Gerard's in Bray, and he used to be getting onto him to come home to Ireland, and he'd get him a job in St. And you know the answer he got? I don't want to teach rich kids. Because it was a private school,
Okay.
so he wouldn't come home and teach rich kids.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So that's it.
So thanks very much, lads.
That's all.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
That was really